Sir Ken Robinson is the most viewed speaker in TED.com history. He is an award-winning educator, speaker, and writer whose dominant focuses have been creativity and innovation across industries. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very proud to present Sir Ken Robinson.
Good evening. It's all true. I am tremendously distinguished. And frankly, it's a great privilege for you to have me here. Really, it's a great pleasure to be here. And I came in yesterday. I've been in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, probably, I don't know, half a dozen, maybe more times. I ought to say to you, right at the very beginning, that I am not from America. I think it's important to point this out in case you get confused. Though I live here now. We moved here 12 years ago, my wife and I and our 2 kids, and we have green cards, and we're applying for citizenship. So there. And there's... Nowadays, people read out my resume as if I'd planned the whole thing. And I say this because I'm confident that they do the same thing to you. Most people do not plan their lives properly. And by the way, it's not a fault. You can't. You simply can't. What happens is you reach a point in your life, various stages in it, where you put together your resume on 2 sides of paper, and you know, it's like the edited highlights of a football game, isn't it? You put all the goals in and miss out all the bad plays. And you put some things in italics and some things in bold, and you offer it as a convincing linear structure to your life. But of course, it's largely an edited version of your life, and you do it because the last thing you want to convey to a prospective employer or somebody in higher education is the actual chaos that you've been living through. And the reason I tell you this is because I'm pretty sure that your life is the same. I don't mean that you've been irresponsible, it's just that you can't predict your life. I mean, you may say, well, I want to be a lawyer, and you become one. You may say, I want to be a veterinarian, and you do. But the actual life that you've led, that you've gone on to lead, to these people, this place, these relationships, these circumstances, you can't plan that. I mean, how many of you correctly have predicted when you're in high school the life that you've gone on to lead? It's not terribly impressive, is it, really, is it? Statistics. And you can be forgiven because the fact is you can't. And the reason this matters is because we plan our education systems as if you can. Our education systems are predicated on this idea of rationalism and linearity. And we pay a tremendously high price for it. So many people go through their lives without any real sense of their true talents or their abilities, and often with no real sense of purpose or direction. And the consequences, I think, can be devastating. I don't mean to say that this is true for everybody who goes through education. I don't mean to say that the consequence is that all schools do dreadful things and terrible jobs, or that teachers should be held accountable. I don't mean that. There are fantastic schools. I'm sure this is one of them. I've read a lot about it. I went to some good schools. I met wonderful teachers. Some people get through the system and do well of it because it's designed for a few people to do well by it. But we pay a price for the great majority of people whose talents aren't touched by this system. And also because we end up suppressing abilities we should all have as we face our lives that turn out to be essential but are marginal when it comes to schooling. And the reason is pretty straightforward. I think that our systems were designed in the 19th century to meet the needs of the old industrial economy. And linearity is built into them. About 30% of the kids who start the 9th grade don't complete the 12th grade. Now, I'm carefully avoiding the word dropout here because it's pejorative. And it sounds like they failed the system. They just couldn't make it. They couldn't hack it. And the fact is, I think it's probably more accurate in many cases to say they didn't fail the system, it failed them. That Americans got irony. When I arrived here and I came across that legislation, No Child Left Behind. Because I thought, whoever thought of that title gets irony. Don't they? Because it's leaving millions of children behind. Because it's predicated on a whole culture of standardized testing. Now, I can see that's not a very attractive name for legislation. Millions of children left behind. I can see that. What's the plan, Mr. President? Well, we propose to leave millions of children behind. And here's how it's going to work. And it is working. It hasn't done anything to stop the drain from the system of students who don't graduate. It continues in the public sector to demoralize teachers. And it's done nothing to raise America's standing in international test scores, the very thing it's designed to promote. You know, and it's the old maxim, if you keep doing something, getting the same result, and it's disappointing, try something else. And it's this something else that I want to talk to you about. You see, all my work is really predicated on three themes. And the first of them is this, that we are living in times of revolution. And I mean that literally, not metaphorically. That there are changes happening in the world now which have no precedent in the history of humanity. And I don't say that lightly, and there's a lot of evidence to support it. I want to just say a couple of words more about that. Secondly, if we're to meet this revolution, we have to think differently. We have to rethink some of the basic assumptions we make about intelligence, ability, talent, and the purpose of education. And the third proposition is if we do all that, we have to do things differently. We have to act differently. I mean, to put it directly, we have to teach differently. We have to run our schools differently. Actually, we have to run our organizations differently. To anticipate it, I think that what we need to do is to change metaphors. The reason I tell you this is because every life is different and every life is unique. And the course of every life is not given. And the reason is that we have tremendous powers of innovation and creativity. And I think it's part of the job of education now to help to cultivate them systematically. But one of the reasons I changed it is that so much has happened in the past 10 years. I mean, just think of technology. When I say there's a revolution, there are two big drivers here. One of them is technology. Think how technology is continuing to transform human life. It always did, by the way. From the invention of fire and the plough, human life has been transformed by technologies, which it's a multiple syllable word for tools. But technologies of all sorts have always extended our reach as human beings. They've extended our physical reach so we can do things with their assistance that we couldn't do without them, whether it's a simple lever or a plough. But they've also extended our minds. They've given us access to possibilities and capabilities that are inconceivable without them. They make things appear on the horizon that we couldn't even glimpse beforehand. They change our worldview. They change our way of understanding. They change our sense of ourselves. Great tools always did that. They're not all transformative. Some tools just help you do things you did before, and they're an improvement on something that came before. But then you get paradigm-shifting tools like print, or the internal combustion engine, or the telescope, or the compass. And suddenly the whole world is reconfigured around these technologies and the creative application of them. Well, it's happening in our own time. 10 years ago, there were no smartphones. There were no social media. The internet really wasn't pervading everybody's life. Email was still pretty much in its infancy for a lot of people. There were no iPads, no iPhones. It was 10 years ago. There was no Flickr, no Tumblr. I mean, 10 years ago, there was no Twitter or Facebook. I mean, 10 years ago, people didn't tweet, did they? I mean, if they did, they were discouraged, weren't they? People would say, I'm sorry, what was that? Would you mind not doing that? This is, we're in a public space. Would you go outside if you feel compelled? Now you have to tweet constantly, otherwise you're kind of social outcast. It's in 10 years. But this isn't over. This has hardly started. That's the truth, it's hardly started. If you look at what's going on in the world of technology, the extreme miniaturization, the pervasive presence of technology is just beginning its trajectory, I think. I would turn up at the library, at the crack of noon, and spend 3 or 4 hours there. I'd get all these references together, and then I'd go to the pub on the way back. Well, now you can search, 100 billion pages of the internet on your cell phone. And if it takes more than 15 seconds, you're getting irritated, aren't you? You're saying, come on, I haven't got all minute. Well, now Google's saying it's a drag to get the phone out of your pocket. We've got that extra burden to carry around with us, and so we can get rid of it. So this device here connects you to the internet, and you control it by moving your eyes to save all that heavy finger thing. But the real horizon that we're heading towards is what Ray Kurzweil calls the singularity. The singularity is the point where information systems will merge with human consciousness, where we don't have computers outside of our body, we have them inside our body, either in the form of nanobots or they may form a device that will be integrated into our minds, into our brain. I mean, I know this sounds kind of preposterous, but it will happen. It's kind of something like this, except you probably won't have the USB port quite there. Many people spend most of their waking lives in front of one sort of screen or another. The truth is that a really transformative technology doesn't add itself to the culture, it changes the culture, like the motor car changed America, fundamentally. So these technologies are accelerating. But there's another factor here when I say that the world is undergoing a revolution, which is this, it's population growth. That's more people on Earth at one time than ever in the history of humanity. And most of it isn't happening in the old industrial economies, it's happening in the emerging economies of Asia, South America, parts of Africa, the Middle East, and so on. About half the population in most Middle Eastern countries is under the age of 25 now. In the old industrial economies, the population is aging because the boomers are refusing to move and give way. So the world is shifting on its axis. Well, it raises all kinds of interesting issues, but one of them it raises is, can we sustain this? At the same rate as the average person in Rwanda, the Earth could sustain a maximum population of 15 billion people. But if everybody on Earth consumed at the same rate as the average person in North America, that's us, the Earth could sustain a maximum population of 1.5 billion. And we're 4 times past that already. So in other words, if the whole world wanted to live as we do in America, and they do, there's no indication, is there, in the emerging economies that people are saying, okay, well, fair enough. You had a great time, and we can see the party's over. So we'll cut back, but send us the photographs. People want what we've had, and they feel they deserve it, and nobody will stop that happening. But if everybody wants to live as we've been living here, if the whole planet wants to do that, then we would need 4 more planets to make that feasible by the middle of the century. And we don't have them. These are massive megacities that are cropping up all over Asia just now and South America. I mean, for example, Greater Tokyo has a population of 34 million people, which is more than the entire population of Canada in one urban spread. So if we don't get this right in cities, we're not going to get it right. So when you combine demography, population growth, technology, and the strain on the planet, and this isn't about global warming, that's another issue that we could talk about separately, but when you just combine those things, on current trends, the way we do things now, we are creating problems which we have yet to discover solutions for. And education was always seen as the way forward. There's a wonderful quote, from H.G. Wells, the science fiction writer, who once said that civilization is a race between education and catastrophe. And I think there's a basic truth in that. Now, my problem, you see, with this is that our current systems were designed for the 19th century, not even the 20th century, certainly not the 21st century, and they're pointing in the wrong direction. But political leaders who only talk about STEM disciplines when they talk about education reform, and then they talk about standardization. The whole implication is that the future is in the hands of the mathematicians, the scientists, the engineers, and nobody else has a role to play. And it indicates to everybody else, if they're in the arts or humanities or some other field, that they can sit this one out. They can sit on the bench until the scientists have figured out the future. But actually, if you look at the success of America as a culture, it's dependent upon people with multiple talents in every field, not just on those few. There was a study done a while ago by IBM. They talked to 1,500 CEOs in 30 countries and 80 different sorts of businesses. They asked them what kept them awake at night. The report, by the way, is called Capitalizing on Complexity. And they said there were 2 things that kept them awake. I'm sure this is true of the CEOs here in the room. The first, they said, is adaptability. These aren't in order, but they said adaptability. And they said, what they mean by this is, how do you adapt to change? How do you run an organization that's flexible, nimble, and adaptable? But the top priority, they said, is creativity. How do we run businesses that have a constant culture of innovation? How do we find people who can think differently, who can come up with new ideas, who can anticipate trends, who can be ahead of the trends. How do we do that? And they complain that some of the graduates from our top universities lack these very qualities. Creativity is a bottom line issue for most companies because it's the lifeblood of innovation. But you don't get a culture of innovation from people who can't think differently. So education has a big cultural role to help people understand their own traditions, why they think as they do, why their habits have been formed as they have been, and how they compare to the way people see things in other cultures and in other parts of the world and at other times. Now, education has a duty to cultural growth and development. But you don't get it only through science. You do get it through science, by the way, since science has such profound cultural influences. But if you want to understand culture, you have to engage with the arts, with music, with theatre, with dance, with poetry. If you want to engage with your spiritual life, you have to engage with the arts and with the humanities. A broad education requires these other disciplines, not as junior partners, but as full-blooded, four-square elements of the curriculum. The real purpose of education, in the end, is personal. We have to recognize that every student is an individual. They need to be seen as part of cultures, they need community engagement, but they're all different. Everybody has their own talents, their own purposes, their own abilities, and their own sense of possibilities. The way in which we engage our kids in the future and in their present is by treating them as individuals, not as vessels whose job it is to absorb information to be tested sometime later on, but to see education as a process of growth and development, one that feeds their spirit as much as their intellect and their feelings. And for that, we need a different style of education. You see, the shift I think we need to make is this. We need to go from seeing education as an industrial process to seeing it as an organic process. You know, human organizations are often compared to mechanisms, but they're not at all like mechanisms. They're like organisms. It's like Malvern School. It's a living, breathing community of people. All the other schools represented here have their own internal cultures, their own expectations, ways of doing things. You can think of the culture of an organization as a living process, and it is. That's why I say that Kodak failed, because it failed to adapt. You know, human organizations follow a life curve of individuals. They're young, they start off with a burst of energy, they mature, and if they're not careful, they die. And in fact, corporate history in all our countries is littered with the corpses of organizations that failed and lost energy. Human communities, though, unlike individuals, can do something different. They can rebirth themselves. They can keep growing if the conditions are right. And it's why my plea to you really is to see that education is personal and to make it personal, not to be trapped into the algorithms of a tradition here which is no longer serving our children. And personalization has to be expressed in the nature of teaching, in the scale and scope and depth of the curriculum. Elvis Presley went to school in Tupelo, Mississippi, and he wasn't allowed in the glee club at school. They said he would ruin their sound. Elvis. Well, we all know what great heights the glee club went on to once they'd managed to keep Elvis out of the picture. You see, human talent, human ability, is like the Earth's natural resources. We are, in the end, organic creatures. You know, our lives are finite, relatively short, and we flourish under certain circumstances, and we decline under other circumstances. We need certain things to make us grow. And human talent is like the world's natural resources. It's often buried beneath the surface. You have to go looking for it. You have to give people the opportunity. You have to put them to the test. You have to give them a chance. You have to help them discover talents they may not even know they've got. And then we ought to, I think, at least be cautious in trying to predetermine the course of their lives and tell them what's best for them. You know, parents have a role. Of course they do. I've got kids, and they look to us for advice. But in the end, this is their life, not my life. And we do everything we can out of hope and responsibility and trust. But what we try not to do is tell them exactly how to live their lives, because they may go on to a life that we can't imagine, and nor can they, providing they're committed and they're doing something that empowers them and impassions them. And education has to be more like that, I think, that we have to see it as an organic process where we encourage the growth of individual talents within a framework of cultural knowledge and understanding. One of the best metaphors I've got for this, and I talked about it recently, it's very brief, is a place not far from where we live now in America called Death Valley. Death Valley is the hottest place in America. Nothing grows there because it doesn't rain. In the winter of 2004, it rained. 8 inches of rain fell on Death Valley. There were floods and all kinds of things. It's the most rain in a single downpour for generations. In the spring of 2005, there was a phenomenon. The whole floor of Death Valley was carpeted in flowers. People came from all across America to see this site that they didn't imagine was possible. I see this time and again in human communities, businesses that thrive with a certain type of leadership. A leadership that understands that the job of a leader is not command and control, but climate control. Great schools, which under great leadership thrive because a visionary head teacher gives people the space to be who they are and to grow and to create conditions where people connect in a certain type of way. I've seen schools go under because they have head teachers who didn't understand it, classrooms that don't work because teachers didn't get it, and ones that do because they do. When I met my wife, she was teaching in Liverpool. She had 45 kids, 10-year-olds in the class, and the place was humming with activity because she understood her job was to create a climate where that could happen. And I think if we make the shift to an agricultural metaphor, to an organic metaphor, away from a mechanical, impersonal, dead metaphor of testing and competition, then I think we'll see a shift, not just in the culture of our schools, but in the achievement of the people who populate them. By the way, even if we get it right, and I think we will, if we're determined enough about it, we still won't be able to predict the future. It has many problems lying ahead of us, but we'll be in a much better position to solve them. And if we do that, I think we have a much better chance of creating a future that we all want to live in. And I think that's worth thinking hard about when we come to look at education. Thank you very much.
Just about a year ago, a colleague from another independent school recommended to me a book called The Third Teacher. And that title derives from the notion that kids have basically three teachers. They have, of course, the classroom teacher, and they have their peers. But there's this third teacher, which is often invisible. And that third teacher is the environment. And it has an enormous impact on how young people learn. So I picked up this book, and I was incredibly impressed by it. It's a beautiful object. It's a beautiful book to begin with. And shortly after that, we began to talk here at Malvern about a master campus plan. And, of course, you interview different architectural firms, and I thought on a whim, let me see if the people who designed the Third Teacher book, this book about designing architectural spaces, let's see if they have some advice about what we could do at Malvern. So on a whim, as I said, I just paged through to the back, looked up the Third Teacher Plus website, and sent an email off into cyberspace. And before long, I had a reply from Mr. Trung Lee, who is sitting here next to Sir Ken Robinson. And to make a long story short, the Third Teacher Plus, which is the educational practice of canon design, is doing Malvern's master campus plan.
I always think of the culture of an organization in two ways. One is the habit. It's habits and habitats. But habits are the algorithms of behavior. A lot of companies trip over innovation because the lines of command are too rigid. All the ideas have to come from the top down, or they get thwarted, and people get penalized for making mistakes and putting the neck out and getting it wrong. You have to tolerate risk, you have to tolerate mistakes, and you have to give people their head if you really want that culture. And you want ideas that will flow across the organization. I think Zappos is a good example of how that works. Tony has written a book called Delivering Happiness, and happiness is a big value in the organization. Not happy, clappy happiness, but people being content and engaged at work. And they've done that. And I say it's not because of the business they're in, it's how they do business that makes the difference. When it comes to education, the thing is, politicians scratch their heads if the whole thing is unfathomable. But actually we know what works. We always knew what works. There are people here from Montessori schools tonight. Maria Montessori was doing this stuff 100 years ago. And there are all sorts of other approaches and methods, and people know if you value individuals, if you treat them holistically, if you create standards and expect things of them, but in a nurturing environment, and you don't treat them as test fodder, we know what works. And these are just a couple of examples of the evidence of it, I think.
The one that I love the most is the Aspen Grove, because the Aspen Grove is not a series of individual trees, but it is one living organism because the roots are all connected to each other. And that's what I feel when I walk through SLA is Chris and all of his staff and his kids are spiritually connected to each other. They feel the stress and they feel the joy. And for me, that comes out, really loud when you walk through any types of a school that has that sense of care. Now, in terms of innovation and what's happening in terms of some of the most innovative company that I've have observed.
But companies that have a culture of innovation recognize that it comes from imagination. You have to stimulate people's imaginations. You can't have a great sports team if everybody spends the whole time sitting on the bench drinking Budweiser. You need to exercise the thing you depend upon, and innovation comes from imagination. You have to feed that. But you also need to give people the skills of creativity. Creativity isn't just some letting loose of psychic power. I mean, creativity is a job of work. I mean, if you see it in design, in music, or writing. I mean, poets don't spend the whole time in a froth. I mean, it's drafting and redrafting and working on things, and it's true in every field. It's a melding of skill and imagination and